All right, welcome back. This is the Swimming Venture Podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Promise Phelon. She rocks. She's great. This episode's great. She's super cool. She happens to be a black woman, and you will notice that we don't spend much time talking about that. And that may surprise you, what in this time of heightened Black Lives Matter interest. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is we recorded this podcast before this kind of renewed Black Lives Matter protests started occurring. We had this interview before COVID really hit. In fact, we did it in person. That's the first reason. The second reason is I try to have as many people of color and women on this podcast as possible. And I don't know how to put this exactly, but they don't need to talk about it every time. And it's their choice, and I support whatever their choice is. And in fact, would probably be annoyed myself if people always expected me to talk about, whatever it was just because I was black or a woman or whatever. So here you go. If you don't know Promise Phelon, you should. She rocks. Fascinating story. Here it is. All right, welcome back. This is the Swimming Venture Podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest is Promise Phelon. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Kent. How are you?
Thank you so much for doing this. This is great.
Yeah.
So Promise is a serial entrepreneur, really, focused on technology companies. She started at BEA when BEA was not a big company. And as you know, BEA became a very large company.
Yeah.
Enormous, and went public. CEO of Tap Influence.
Most recently, yeah.
Which is a big, we used it a bunch in like previous companies that I've worked at, and they got acquired by a public company.
Yeah, I sold that company in July of 2018.
And has now switched to the investing side.
Yeah.
She's the CEO and founder of Growth Warrior Capital and is working on a book as well.
Yeah.
So this is quite a career you've got going here. So how did you get started? Like BEA is this is the traditional way to start, right? This is like a big company. And
it's interesting. Yeah, so it's interesting. I feel like entrepreneurship has become de rigueur, but it comes from underdogs. It comes from people who don't have the traditional pathways. Yeah. And so as I talk about it in the Way of the Growth Warrior book, it was how I supported myself through college.
Being an entrepreneur.
It's
interesting.
So, I tell this funny story here. Like, I used to run dogs. Like, that was how I stayed fit in college. Yeah. And so it was a way to make money. And I realized I was exchanging my time for money. And that's like a really bad exchange.
Yeah.
And then I started a company. And I realized, I can scale massively. So I started a company in my sorority, essentially copy room and closet. And so I got started there, sold it. And then
what did the sorority company do?
Well, so the sorority company it started out as a PR writing firm. Like we wrote press releases and did marketing for physicians. And then over time, we were able to build a tech solution that would automate a lot of this.
Right.
And that happened, and we sold the company to our largest client at the time. Wow. And I used that money to fund going to grad school, and I was super young. But between my first and second year in grad school in LA, I met a woman who got a job at BEA Systems. And I remember, and I was like, BEA, it was the initials for the founders,
right.
Bill, Ed, and Alfred. And so,
that's so funny.
This woman named Barbara was this incredible, she was more than a mentor, Kent. She was like, she gave me a job I didn't deserve at the time. Do you know what I mean? That person, I imagine you did it at Friendster. Like, I imagine there were people who you can look back and say, you didn't deserve that, but it was so important for me to help you. And so she was a steward, champion, and I got into tech. And I got to tell you, I see a lot of people who come into tech and into entrepreneurship not having that big company experience.
Absolutely.
I benefited. I started... I want to say, I'll have to get the actual numbers, but I was in the hundreds of employees there. When I left, we were like 4,000. Like, it was some crazy swing, public splitting stock craziness. But I got to work with Lynn Vojvodich, who became the CMO of Salesforce. She was my boss at one point. Yeah. Ivan Kuhn, who's a successful entrepreneur who you may know. So I had the benefit of kind of working with those people.
Yeah.
And then started my entrepreneurial journey.
That's funny. That's such a shift that's occurred. Because I started out at Deloitte, and so it's a big company, and you're like, this is stupid, and everything's everything. But then you realize, like, big companies have to have certain systems.
Yes.
And so that when you get into a startup, you get like where you're headed.
Right.
If so many people now just come straight out of college and they're like a 6-person startup with free this and that and no professional HR, and it's just odd. Even like Steve Jobs, like he didn't just start. He was at Atari, or he was somewhere first. It's just so different. Were your parents doing something entrepreneurial? Is that like why did you start running dogs and starting sorority businesses? Like,
that's a great question. I mean, I come from a line. My father, this is so interesting. He's a golf pro. He played professional golf for my entire life.
Not what I was going to guess.
No, it would not be what you. He's a tall black dude.
Yeah,
and is an incredible golfer and still plays. He's probably playing right now.
Yeah,
and my mother, my family's background is West Indian. And so that heritage tends to be much more entrepreneurial, much more kind of spirited. But like, if you think about it, we've all been entrepreneurial. Like, look at the number of people who side hustle.
Yeah.
And so I didn't go to Harvard, didn't have any pedigree. And so the entrepreneurial route became almost a way to, manifest destiny.
Yeah.
Because it was one that I could do with my own efforts and
will.
So
how did you make your way out of it went public while you were there? Yeah,
so we went public, and then, I was incredibly young, and like I was like, splitting stock, what does all this mean? What's all this stuff? And I remember I'd been working directly for Ivan, and we were doing some econometric analysis of the profitability of our customers. Okay. You know what that you actually know what that means. Yeah. So doing a lot of regression on profitable customers, and I'd gotten to the point where I realized I was a really bad employee. The stock had gone up, we had split twice, then it had come down, and the company texture had changed, like the personality was different. And so I got to a point where I was just like, I want to go out on my own. And I learned an important lesson. So I remember the day, this is how entrepreneurial I used to be in my early 20s. The day I realized I could monetize my skill set.
Yep.
I just like walked in and I was like, here's my resignation.
Wow.
And my boss was like, she gave me the best advice. She said, there's a psychological principle that people don't remember the engagement, the honeymoon, the wedding. They don't remember any of that. All they remember is the divorce and you throwing their stuff out in the street. And so how you end relationships is essential. And so I ended up staying at BEA for 6 more months while starting my other company. And it was a great transition. Like, Ivan has been an investor and advisor, so it was a great way to kind of get that boost. Bill Coleman, who ran the company, was a mentor. So it was a great time to be there, but I also was able to get the support as I transitioned out of the company.
Right. So you've had a lot of mentors, it seems like, in your career. Or you look up to a lot of people. Like, I was reading about you, like, you got the Tony Robbins thing, Ray Dalio.
Oh, I love Ray Dalio. I love Tony.
Like the kind of mentor crowd. Bill Campbell.
Yeah, Bill was a great mentor.
What was Bill? I had a couple people on the podcast who worked with Bill Campbell. I never met him. I just heard he threw like green eye shades at people. And didn't sound very nice to me.
I would say that one of the things that when you're an underdog in Silicon Valley, we can talk honestly here, right?
Yeah, of course.
One of the things that you realize is your reality is different than other people. Like, everyone's reality is challenged, right? Like, if you are raising money, raising venture capital, you got to do a bunch of meetings. There's a lot of feedback, a lot of rejection. But you realize as an African-American woman who has no pedigree that you're doing 10, 20 times more meetings, you're doing more pitches, and you're like, why is this happening to me? And you make up your own story.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting down with Bill, and he was the first person who said, in this place, you are a stranger.
Yeah.
And it's going to take you longer. It's going to be harder, but you're going to live longer and you're going to emerge more successful because you'll have deeper skills. Yeah. And I mean, the first time I heard him say that, I was like, well, I'm out. Like, why am I doing this? And he was like, wait a minute. Like, the best have a lot of rejection and repetition. Wow. So he was emotional, cried all the time. He felt always heart first. He was brutally, like, no one ever said, when you sit down with a traditional VC, he's looking for any reason, right, not to invest in you because you're a stranger to him.
Yeah.
And he was the first person in my life to ever just come clean with it. And I appreciated that. And then he would also help you. He'd be like, okay, so make an introduction. And he was amazing at that.
That's amazing. Yeah, I talked to Charles Hudson, like one of the few black venture capitalists, and he said, if you're a white venture capitalist, I mean, you don't even need to say it, but if you're just a venture capitalist, but you're probably a white guy, he's like, you probably know a woman. You might be married to a woman. You might not know a black guy, like if you're a venture capitalist, like in your neighborhood, wherever you live. And so he's like, that's just this other level of them just not being familiar with you. Like not in a overt way, just like they walk around all day and everyone they know is either a white guy or a white woman. And when you come in, you're a stranger. You're new to them.
Have you read the latest book by Malcolm Gladwell, Talking to Strangers?
I heard Oprah Winfrey interviewed him about the book. That's my fake version of having read the book.
It's fascinating. Yeah. But he talks about this. And to your point, I think that's the biggest opportunity that we should all be thinking about. So imagine if one group of people who are pedigreed of one race, of one background, are investing in people of that same race and that same background, right? Imagine how many billions of other opportunities exist outside of that small cohort.
Yeah.
And so when I think about, there's a story that I heard, and it's so funny. So if you're an African-American woman, you've probably had your hair braided.
Yeah.
Like 99% probable, right? And so there was a woman who was pitching, this could be lore or could be true, who was pitching companies in Silicon Valley, and she went to some white traditional VCs, and they said, well, I talked to my wife about this idea, and there's no way that anyone would want to have your hair braiding technology. And so, to Charles's point, right? Yeah, we got to diversify in order to get access to opportunity.
Does the thing kill you? So my partner and I, we're two white guys, like we're the guys.
Yeah,
make fun of this every time there's a podcast, and it's about how'd you get into venture capital.
Yeah,
and you just 90% of the time I'm right when I say they're gonna say they fell into it. And they say they fell into it.
Interesting.
And you're like, you didn't fall into it from like the projects in Chicago. You fell into it. It's like, well, my roommate's dad, there's always a dad involved. And I went to Stanford. And, my friend, I was like, it's so funny that they don't hear it, first of all, like what they're saying. And then second of all, it's like, just make something up. Like, just say, oh, ever since I was a kid, I wanted, it's because it's a lovely job. You shouldn't be telling people that you just fell into it. Like, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a venture capitalist, and I worked really hard, and I got it. But nope, they just fell into it.
I accidented into it.
That's it. So how do you animate yourself out of BEA? You became...
I started a company at that point. I started a services company, and kind of similar to one of my favorite companies is called Profitwell. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. Great, amazing SaaS company. Oh, delicious. But it started out as a services company, and so we did too. And so I ran that for about 7 years, and then said I want to get back into tech, because we had we were tech-enabled services, and then I just went on to start companies. And then I realized that it was very hard for me to raise money, very challenging. Yeah. And I started a company in 2000, and actually I met you in 2009.
You did?
Yeah. We met through Steve Bannerman.
Yes.
Oh, I met you in Los Gatos at like a Chinese hole-in-the-wall place.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so... then I started raising money, and I realized, like, oh, how's this venture thing work? And then a lot of people said you'd be an amazing, turnaround CEO. And that's how, so I joined a company called The Resumator in 2013, and I joined as CRO and COO and was part of that turnaround. The company became Jazz HR. And then I took over at Tap Influence in 2015 as CEO.
Right.
And I saw a stat. My team did some research, and It's rare that a woman follows a man, a CEO, so takes over for a man,
Right.
white male. And it's even more rare that a woman solo CEO raises venture capital. And I've done that multiple times now.
Yeah.
And so I used to, bemoan the fact that I didn't get the Uber CEO job, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. We all want it.
Yeah.
But now I actually believe this tide has turned.
Yeah.
And I just went through a very challenging negotiation with 11 men. Was the only woman involved in this company that I venture studioed. And it almost got to the point where I was like, guys, let's sit down. Like our lens and our language is so different, but we're not talking about it.
Yeah.
And for the first time in my life, Kent, I didn't feel like a bitch by saying, guys, we got to find a way to make this work. And we're all coming at it from different perspectives. And I'm the stranger.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the tide has turned because the traditional people who win in this kind of market are more aware than they've ever been.
Yeah, I heard. I was meeting recently with the guy who runs Deloitte for Northern California.
Okay.
It's like $1 billion business. And he was talking about this it's a law, but where California-based boards have to have a woman on them.
Yeah.
And then depending on the size, in a couple of years, it has to be 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And he's like, the implication of that is that basically 110% of new board members need to be women. Like every single one, and they need to get rid of some guys to meet that. He says it's actually become a little bit of a problem for Deloitte because they're kind of late career women are kind of just leaving Deloitte, and they can go on 5 or 6, maybe handle about 5 boards.
Yeah,
get paid about the same amount, and then work maybe 2,000 hours a year instead of 3,000. I mean, he's not upset. He's like,
this is a reality.
It's just a bummer that we're losing these great women, but he gets it. But it's just interesting that like that, as an example of a force that's kind of coming in where, boards in California are going to have at least one woman on them now.
Yeah, that's changing. Women are also changing in how we relate to one another. Women are recognizing, like, that was one of the things that, TAP I joined in 2015.
Yeah. It's
a services company doing very little revenue, but had a ton of venture invested in it. And so my job was to take it from a professional services company with 30% gross margin, 35%, and turn it into a SaaS company and do it outside of Silicon Valley. Now, I'm so naive at the time. Yeah. I'm like, this will be so easy. I'll do it.
Where did you do it?
I did it in Boulder.
Okay. Now, along with your father being a professional golfer, I would not think that you're,
we moved to Boulder.
A black woman's like, I want to go to Boulder.
I want to go to Boulder. So I went from being like, 0.1% to being 0.000.
It's like the whitest place in the world. Isn't it? Like, the whole town's like a Bernie rally.
It is a little bit, right? And so it was probably the hardest professional thing I've ever done. Really? Changing the business model, existing in a culture that wasn't mine. Like, we grew up here. And when you grow up here, everything is like, you have so much context. And so when you go there and you talk about options, people are like, well, what does all this mean? Yeah. And so being even more of a minority was an interesting experience, but just the company, the timing in the market. But I changed the business model in 3 quarters, raised $14 million up round, and then sold it in July of 2018 and to a public company. And that was that run. And it's funny, you kind of realize that, once you get the check and it all deposits in your bank, you're kind of like, so who am I? And so you mentioned Tony Robbins. Like, I realized that being a CEO did not actually make me happy. Mm-hmm. And there were no fruits that could be sweet enough to do that job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, I imagine you experienced that at Friendster, right?
Yeah.
Where you kind of realize, I'm doing this because my identity's attached to it. It doesn't bring joy. It's hard.
Yeah.
There's a payout. That payout, it doesn't really, it doesn't really impact you, right? Like, because your life doesn't materially change. I still have my favorite jacket that I bought at Express.
It's a cool jacket.
You know, right?
Yeah, that's super cool.
I still wear this jacket.
Yeah.
And it doesn't actually change you.
Yeah.
And so that's when I met Tony Robbins. And that was an accidental thing. But it was transformational.
So you met him.
Yeah, so I went to Unleash the Power Within, and I was like, I held my nose. I was like, my mom was listening to Tony Robbins in the 80s.
Yeah.
I don't know if you, right? And he's...
I loved, everyone makes fun of me all the time, but I had the, like, CDs or something of Tony
cassette
Robbins.
tapes, right?
Yeah. I don't know. It's just cool.
So I go to this not knowing what to expect, Unleash the Power Within, and he does this practice called the Dickens process. Have you heard of it? So he basically, part of what makes us unhappy is our attachment to our personality and identity. I'm an African-American woman. My life's hard. People don't want to invest. Like, all that is what's, of the 50,000 thoughts I'm thinking a day, if they're my personality, that's the majority of what I'm thinking, right? Yeah. And so that constant stream of noise is creating unhappiness, right? And so what he does at this event is he gets you to separate yourself from that identity, because you imagine it 20, 30, 40, 60 years from now, and it feels terrible. And so that process, a la Dickens, is a future view of what happens if you continue to feel this way about yourself. Yeah. And then you realize, oh, my happiness can actually be unconditional, and and I can separate myself from the things that I know impede my ability to be happy. And so it was such a life-changing process. And then he started mentoring me. So I had the experience of being mentored by him, which he's a badass. Like, no one knows, but he runs 60 companies.
Yeah. Oh, it's when he talks about it once in a while.
Yeah.
And he runs 60 companies, has a huge compound in Fiji or something.
And in Florida, which I've been to, which has a submarine built into the underground.
Right. And then the conference business alone, or whatever, his seminar business alone, is a monster.
It's massive.
And then he mentors, I think Bill Clinton was one of his guys.
Serena Williams, Kevin Hart, Conor McGregor.
It's kind of amazing.
Mike Tyson.
Yeah. So people shouldn't make fun of me anymore.
They should not. You're super cool. But I believe Tony has changed. I believe Tony is in the transformation business and not the motivation.
Right.
If you will.
Yeah. So great. It's kind of amazing. You've had Bill Campbell and Tony Robbins and Ray Dalio. You've kind of interacted with a few of the big ones.
Yeah, and I've not been mentored by Ray, but I'm a devotee, right?
Yeah.
He's someone I admire and have met a couple times, but I feel blessed by it. And I look at this career switch, investing, mentoring. I bought a couple companies, and so I'm in this experimentation phase. Yeah. And so the book, The Way of the Growth Warrior, was a forcing function to sit down and say, okay, codify what you've learned to date.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Now this is wait, so how do you get back to the Bay Area from
Boulder?
Yeah.
That's a great question.
So what do you make of? Because I had Kelly Fitzsimmons on. She runs a business back in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Which it's crazy. I was at a book thing with her. Book thing. Really, I really did go to college. And she, at the end of it, it turns out that her family runs. Oh, okay. So your dad, golfer. Her family runs a factory that makes paper cups or something.
Huh.
Every paper cup in the country, huge, and. At the end of it, I'm just telling the story because it's interesting. At the end of it, she goes, oh, by the way, my dad did this crazy thing. He gave the company to the employees. So when he was kind of retiring and had enough or whatever and trying to do with the company, he just gave it to the employees. So they all just own part of this clearly close to $1 billion company. It's kind of a crazy story.
Holy smokes.
But she found, so Milwaukee for her is she comes to the coasts,
right?
Gets money, kind of like a politician, comes to the coast, gets money, and then goes there and hires people who aren't leaving for Uber and Google and Facebook and other things every 12 seconds. And so for her, Milwaukee's kind of an advantage. But what did you find in Boulder?
It was I'm not from there. I definitely feel myself being kind of a Bay Area person.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you feel that too. I was culturally not a great match for Boulder. Yeah. And so the company's aspiration wasn't a great match. And so we moved the company out of Boulder to the Bay Area.
Okay.
So we moved from Boulder to basically Mountain View. And so had a whole Bay Area data science, engineering, marketing, the whole team we just moved.
Yeah.
And so that was about a year before I sold the company, about a year and a half before I sold the company. We needed that Bay Area. It's a rare, beautiful place, like it's a rare, beautiful place.
It's weird. As I travel, I've traveled all over the world for different companies. And when you go to these places, they've got like little pieces of it, like this Frankenstein, like, oh, it's Singapore. We've got this little kind of innovation center, but failure's not a thing. The bankruptcy laws don't work. There's no like university like Stanford, where people are entrepreneurs. They're just like, it's just not the same. Like Boulder's tried to be a Silicon Valley for years, and it's just not.
Yeah, and I noticed that the good news about those places is employees have much more balance, and that's so right. you don't have some of the crazy. The challenge is the culture, the stickiness, the understanding, the drive. That also is different in those places.
Yeah,
but I imagine that's going to change because I feel like Gen Z and younger millennials, they're not as inspired to work hard to make a company great. Yeah. I think they're much more interested in how to have their own quality of life.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see less of that here.
Yeah. It's a little weird. You're supposed to work first for a while.
Right.
And then get to the quality
of life.
Who is it? Like Jeff Bezos says something where he's like, yeah, I don't want you to be work-life balanced. Like if you work here, I want you to be insanely work focused. And I think his point is you want the people who are that person who really enjoy it. Like there are people who are just animated by.
It's funny because when I was Seth Godin, I'm not sure if you know who that is a friend of mine. And so I was writing the book and I sent him the galley copy and he's like, I love it. I want to talk to you. And he gives me all these notes and he says, so is this book for the person who wants to run like a recurring revenue business and just live on the beach in Bali? Yeah. Or is this book for someone else? And it was like, wow, okay. I believe that to be a true entrepreneur, part of what you're doing is you're wringing out the spiritual part from the practice.
Interesting.
So the person who wants to run something and kind of live on the beach, that's a different profile than you or me, right? That's not who we are. But I think that what the interesting person is someone who says, my growth is going to come from this, my spiritual growth is going to come from being an entrepreneur. Yeah. Do you remember when Keller, in her beautiful podcast with you, talks about the suicides?
Yes.
She talks about the fact that like, I feel like we've all been there. I feel like after you have a term sheet fall through because of like after you have an employee go on Glassdoor and like just pummel you, like you get to a place where you're like, why am I doing this? Who am I? And you start to question your identity. Unless you get the spiritual juice from that, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
And so I wrote this book for the person who is looking to have spiritual mastery come from the entrepreneurial journey.
And so how did the idea to write a book, it's already a bad idea to be an entrepreneur. It's a really bad idea to write a book. What made you say, hey, I'm going to, there's something here that needs to be written down and I need to spend however many years it takes to do it?
Wow, that's a great question. So I wanted to take my learnings and write them down. Yeah. That was important to me, for me. Yeah. And kind of map out these 7 skills and get help from people I knew and respected. But I felt that what's missing on the bookshelves are people who didn't fall into it.
Yeah.
It's I talk about my stutter. I talk about having a single mom. I talk about the fact that
the idea that you have a stutter just doesn't compute with me. I believe you, of course, but you sound like perfectly stutter-free.
I'm not always stutter-free, especially not in the morning when I haven't had coffee. But I wrote the book for the person who can relate to being an underdog.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's most people. I believe that Silicon Valley has given us the impression that the world, all we see when we look out on the horizon is ourselves.
Yeah.
And this is not reality. Reality is there are a lot of kids who have single moms. There's a lot of kids who can't pull together $10,000 for friends and family. Like when I was starting, no one in my friend circle had 10 grand for me. My mom didn't have 10 grand for me.
Yeah.
And so that idea is, even the framework that we've built here, the blueprint of how we operate, is a reflection of ourselves. It's actually not real. And so I wrote this book because I wanted people to know you can take what you see on Forbes where people are falling into these roles and you can boil it down to 7 skills that are measurable and you can hold yourself accountable to improving those skills, right? Versus being like, well, I don't know how to be Bill Gates and I don't know how to, you know, like,
right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when you see Jeff Bezos is like #1 in the world and you don't know why, it's intimidating.
Yeah. Why do so many people, so you have had a stutter and figured out how to get over it. So many people I talk to who are really successful seem to have had something, like dyslexia in particular. Like does not seem to be, if your kid's dyslexic, like not a problem. I mean, it's a problem, you have to deal with it. But seriously, the number of people, like, you know, Gavin Newsom's one of them, the governor of California, it just seems like a lot of people have overcome stuff who were successful entrepreneurs. Not the venture capitalists so much. They kind of grew up somewhere nice, and you know their college roommate's dad got them a job.
Aren't you a venture capitalist?
Yes, but I'm trying to be the one. Like we try to be but I've been an entrepreneur, and the one thing that like we do not abide is like venture capitalists complaining about their job. We're like compared to being an entrepreneur, it is not a hard job. Being an entrepreneur is such a difficult job.
And wouldn't the pattern of adversity be the best preparer for that?
Yeah, but there's not many venture capitalists who are entrepreneurs.
And that's what I'm in the throes now of deciding, do I build a venture studio? Because I know I've venture studioed a few companies, or do I move more towards, I know I'm going to always be a mentor because as you said, I've benefited, but you know, I'm also considering doing more PE. But I got to tell you, when you sit down with someone who's been raising money and doesn't know why they're not getting yeses, and you tell them why and you write them a check, it is potentially the most beautifully explosive, happy experience that I've ever experienced.
Right.
And so I believe that more entrepreneurs are becoming. Like, I love the venture studio model. That's where we play. That's where I think entrepreneurs play.
Yeah.
It's because you're not just betting on ideas. You're like germinating, you know, like you're turning it on. And so I feel that there'll be more of us.
Yeah, I think we didn't realize this until we started this fund. And then we started realizing that the people are doing there's kind of this false syllogism, I guess, where people are like, oh, I was an operator at Google. And the joke, of course, is operator means literally you had a job. Like, that's what it means. But they're like, well, I was this at Google, and Google was a startup. But you're like, but you didn't start Google. You were there when you were getting paid $900,000 a year, and like, you know, it's just a cash machine. And so if you look at people who really built things, Andreessen Horowitz did, the Freestyle Capital guys did. But it's actually a much smaller number.
It's very small. It's going to grow.
Yeah, it is already. And now, you know, every entrepreneur, it's kind of weird, but every entrepreneur has got like some side fund. So they're investing and they're being an entrepreneur. But we didn't really realize till we started, like, yeah, it's not that common to be an entrepreneur than a venture capitalist.
I think it also makes you much more circumspect.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah, much more empathic. I mean, just you know what people are going through.
Yeah, and you're less judgmental when it's not perfect, right? So, like when there's a company I mentor and they've got a really challenging sales cycle, and I don't just say, let me give you this blog to go look at for unit economics. Let's look at your unit economics and talk about why they are this way.
Yeah.
And do we have the right customer? And have we looked at the sales team? Like, I believe, as entrepreneurs, are more empathic to what is actually happening inside the company. I think that venture capitalists, the traditional kind, are very good at raising from LPs.
Yeah.
And so if you could bridge and you have both traditional and then operator, I think you just get an explosive
Oh, that's absolutely what we found out, because we're kind of in the middle of it now. And yeah, there's people who are just good at LP. Either they're rich, so they happen to know people
Right.
who can write $1 million checks,
Right.
or they're just good at it. They're good at that kind of sales cycle LP schmoozing. Because you'll meet these LPs like, oh, we invested in this fund. You're like,
Why?
Never heard of that guy. It doesn't sound that interesting. Like, no, that guy just got to you, and good for him. But he got to you, and he pitched you and did it. I mean, like being a VC, like if you can raise the money, you can be a VC.
Well, let me ask you a question. When I moved here, I rented a room for $600 a month in Cupertino. That whole area where I rented is gone now, and they're like multi-million dollar homes. So do you think that Silicon Valley can sustain itself?
I don't know. You know, when I moved here, it was kind of like that. I mean, the version was I lived in San Francisco with a roommate, and our rent was $1,200, and so $600 each. I don't know. And what was cool about it, the thing that I miss, is that it was really artistic, San Francisco.
Yeah.
And some people, you know, I met like one of my good friends, the venture capitalist, Josh Felser. We were on the board of Theater Artaud, which was like a local theater in San Francisco. And what was cool is it was like very artistic, yet I was the business guy, but they were cool with that. Like, you're the nerdy business guy. Like, come into our, little party or our little art thing. And that seems really gone. And I wonder if there's part of it too. You know, people talk about Steve Jobs being kind of like the hippie. You know, you combine the hippie with the businessman and you get an iPhone. So I think that part's gone. Like, being in tech was kind of this cool, edgy thing. And now it's sort of like, it seems like the same guy over and over again.
Innovating on the same idea.
Yeah, or just working at some huge company like Facebook. But what we're seeing now is more people having a head here, like the CEO's here, and the business development person's here in San Francisco, but the team is somewhere else.
I love that.
Like the team's back in France.
Yeah.
I mean, there's two models. One is the team's back in France, the team's back in Croatia. The other model is the team's like all over the freaking place.
I was going to speak at SaaStr this week. 20,000 people.
Yeah.
And then poof, it's canceled.
Yeah.
And so I feel that we're getting place independent.
Yeah.
Right? And
that's the theory, though. It seems so not human, though.
It isn't human. It is not human.
Like human behavior. It just seems like eventually, really, are we all just going to be sitting at home?
But I wonder if what we're going to find are strains of culture that are identifiable.
Yeah.
Right? Like I go anywhere, and I'm very Silicon Valley. I grew up here, and I meet other people who aren't from here who are still very Silicon Valley. Yeah. So I wonder if we're going to find strains of culture where that exists.
Maybe I never did this podcast over the phone.
Why?
I don't know how, for starters. I couldn't figure it out. I spent 2 minutes and I couldn't figure it out. But it's just not the same quality. It's not the same vocal quality. If I can't look at you, I don't have a sense of what's going on. It's like a conference call. And there's enough people I can get to in the Bay Area that I just never did it. So I don't love. I know the work from home thing's a thing, but I don't love it really as much as everyone else.
Well, you want to interact, and we still need that. One of the things that. So I drove down from Tahoe, so I have a mountain house up in Tahoe, and I'm on about half an acre, and so I saw a bobcat the other day, and I was just looking out, and I was like, your mind changes when your focal point is no longer the city and horns, and it's this deep nature, and the pace at which things happen, I think, also helps. So I wonder if there's not a potential of having a balance where you have one part of your life where you are fully expressed, and you have another part where you get that reflection.
Right.
Because both are needed.
Yeah. I don't know. I have my business partner alleges, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here, but he alleges that anybody with kids who says they're working from home is not. He's like, I have 2 kids. When I'm at home, there is no way that I am working.
Fully distracted.
That I'm pulled into the mix. But think about New York. People in New York are on top of each other. It's a hive. They're there because it's a hive. People in New York, I don't think want to be at home on the Zoom call all the time. Maybe they do. I don't know. It's my prejudice about New York, I guess. But it seems like people are in New York because they want to be mixed up with lots and lots of other people. And people are in, the prairie states or wherever they are because they don't. I don't know. This is my prejudice against people.
Right, the prairie states. I'm going to tell them all you said that.
I don't know where that came from, like Little House on the Prairie or something like that. So in writing the book, like what happens? Well, so you start a private equity firm, Growth Warrior Capital.
I wanted to buy companies because when I was selling TAP, that's a whole process of selling a company.
Yeah,
have you done that before?
Yeah,
it's.
I've done the tough one.
Right.
Like there's the killing it, everybody wants it. We're just talking price, and then there's the like, please buy my company one.
Both bring out different parts, right?
For sure.
And as we were selling the company, and I was spending a lot of time with other buyers and investment bankers and negotiating and with my board, I realized that there are a lot of non-venture backed companies that are doing, 5-10 million in revenue, 25% EBITDA, and that's a big space. Yeah. And they don't have a lot of professional leadership, and they don't know what to do next. Yeah. And so I spent about a year and a half doing research on that sector. And so we bought some companies to prove the thesis. And so that was one half. And then I also started a venture studio effort, more of like a pledge fund, where I put my money and others' money into starting companies. And my aspiration was to figure out, can we go from zero to revenue in 6 months, right? And so we did it in 9, but like no company, to vetted idea, team, capital raised, product, revenue. And so my aspiration is to actually have a fund that can do both those things.
And do you come up with the idea, or does the entrepreneur come? Do you find an entrepreneur, or what's... what are you doing versus the entrepreneur?
Yeah, so the entrepreneur is operating, right? Because I think there are more people out there who can take a vetted idea that's got some level of funding and execute it than there are people who can do the whole thing. Yeah,
that's so interesting. And then how do you contrast that to the PE? Do you know Melody Hobson, by the way?
I'm obsessed. Yes, I know who she is.
That's so funny. That's one of my favorite things to do is to tell people about her, because nobody knows who she is.
She's amazing.
And so I tell people, there's this like black woman who runs a company that's one of the biggest, just FYI, it's like one of the biggest private equity firms on the planet.
$13 billion.
Yeah, she bought McCormick, the guys who make the spice.
Yeah.
And she's married to George Lucas, too.
And that's pretty cool, too.
Yeah. Like, did you know that? Like, most people are like, no, I didn't.
She's dope.
Yeah. He's married to, like, the one person who's as rich as he is.
and cool.
Like, yeah, you just wouldn't expect it.
Yeah.
So how do you contrast the private equity to the studio? Do you like the PE part too?
I mean, okay, so I've started companies, I've built companies, I've gotten funding for companies, I've operated, I've turned around, I've split apart, I've joined together, I've bought, sold. The idea of creating value through business transactions is a horizontal thing. Yeah. And so when I get excited about a deal, whether it's taking an existing company and creating something better and new from it, or starting something, I don't necessarily, and this is my present tense, I'm okay in a year reversing that, but I don't see that there's a massive difference between them. Right? Because really what you're trying to do is you're trying to harness capital, both human and financial. And you're studying the market, you're making predictions. How you make money is different, right? I mean, with PE, you're making money through profits and through an exit, but it's more profit first than exit, right? Whereas with a startup, it's exit first, right? That's what you're thinking about.
Right.
But that calculus isn't that different. And so I love buying companies. I love the process. And I tend to be more trusted as a buyer because I'm talking to someone that I've done their job before. Yeah. Imagine if you come in you're a big private equity firm and you've never run a company. When you're selling a business, you're thinking about your legacy. How will this be perceived? What happens to my employees? What happens to my customers? Yeah. Do you value this? You've got this list of like things that you're doing mind math on. And a traditional buyer is just thinking, risk-adjusted returns.
Right.
Is this accretive? But when you're an entrepreneur on the buying side, you want to maintain that person's legacy.
Yeah.
You want to take care of, like, it's a different thing. And so when I think about doing any kind of deal, I look at what I want to be able to do is to create value in any of those scenarios. Because what we're great at is the horizontal stuff. Put anything you want on top of it, right?
Yeah.
It's about people and money. And how you realize that return is slightly different, but the goals are the same.
Right.
You want to return money to the people who gave it to you, right?
So as you wrote the book, is there something you kind of learned, or did you put down what you knew and that was the book?
So writing a book is challenging.
Yeah.
This is my fourth attempt.
I could have told you that.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
It seems really hard.
Why didn't I call you beforehand?
You should have a podcast. It's really easy.
It's really easy. No, so the approach that I took is I realized that when you're writing a book, you can't do it by yourself. You can't. You need the person who organizes the book and the thoughts is often different than the person who gives the intellectual property. Yeah. And so I let go of the organization. And so I had a great person who just was like a developmental editor who just heard me talk and said, okay, what you're distilling are skills. And then let's figure out what those skills are. So we had 9, then we had 4, then we realized, okay, there are 7 skills. And so then it was a process of looking at all the situations in my life, interviewing people I respect, and then putting in, these are the 7 non-negotiable skills that every successful entrepreneur has. And so I learned from that process, and I was able to see my areas of strength and weakness or blind spots. And then it was a process of letting go and surrendering to that process. And what I learned is, and I think Keller talked about this, as a woman who is a quote unquote underdog or minority in the room, you're taught not to have a lot of expression, not to tell personal stories, not to cry at work. And in writing the book, it was the first time that I shared my frailties. Yeah. And so having that imprint was sickening, right? Yeah. Because you want to be perfect and beautiful and smart and prepared for every meeting. And no one is. Yeah. And so it was a delicious
When does the book, well, let me kind of finish up with this. One of the things I've realized in doing this podcast is people all over the world listen to it because they're outside of Silicon Valley and they want to get into it. Right. Either because the wealth being created here is amazing or the technology being here is great or something like that. So it takes me a second to remember, like, everyone's not in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Like, I think everyone is, because everyone I know is.
We just look outside and see ourselves.
Yeah. I just see myself. Like, a young black woman, young, whatever, somewhere in the world looking towards Silicon Valley or coming up through college, how should they think about this place? How should they navigate it? Is it too hard for them? Is it, like, it's hard for me, and I'm a white guy, so.
It's challenging for all of us. Yeah. And it's going to be more challenging as an underdog. And let's just admit that. But if you want it and it means that much to you, do it. Yeah. Like, raising triplets, I imagine, is really hard, but a lot of people are out there doing it. Yeah. So I guess what I would want them to see, thank you for asking that question, is don't tie your personality to it being hard. Don't tie your identity to it being hard. Just play. Just enjoy the process. And I believe that anyone who's successful, like, I look at people like Shelley Archambault, who is an African-American CEO. I look at other people like Melody, who've been successful. They're probably, great quote from the book Anti-Fragile. Do you know the guy who wrote The Black Swan?
Yes, Nassim Taleb, yeah.
He said, never hire the surgeon who looks like a surgeon. And there are a lot of people here in the Valley now who are realizing that. And don't hire the CEO who looks like one. And so I would say, if you're going to come here, do your research, get a ton of mentors, and don't worry. You don't look like the surgeon. Yeah. And someone's going to recognize that you're probably better.
You know who's killing everyone right now is the Zoom CEO. he's like Chinese
Yeah.
and kind of has an accent. When he was raising money, he was like kind of too old because he was in his 40s.
Yeah.
And like all these VCs were like, yeah, doesn't look like the guy.
Not the surgeon.
He's the guy. Like he's a $30 billion company now.
And everyone use it. I mean, everyone, it's just Zoom's crushing.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Promise,
here. I
this was
appreciate it.
fantastic.
Thank you.
All right, this has been the Something Measured podcast. I will talk to you next time. Thanks.